Hello everyone, welcome to a new Post-Mining Café. Our topic today is public policy evaluation, and it's a new application area that I haven't seen before, so I'm very excited to share this with you here today. And I'm joined by Nuno Serra. Hi Nuno.
Hi everyone.
Yes, thanks so much for joining us. Nuno is the director of Food4Sustainability, and he will tell us a little bit more about his work and his projects in a moment. The session today is really showing some creativity that you can have in terms of finding data where there isn't really any post-mining data. In that sense, it's a nice continuation of the last post-mining café, actually, where we talked about data preparation and what you do if you don't have any data. Sometimes you have to be creative and find it, or make the data, to analyze it. And I think Nuno has shown a really interesting example for that, and that's why we thought it's useful to share that with you, with the community, to share what he has done. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your presence, and I hope you can also see some value in this creative approach to finding data and to, in this case, we applied process mining to a field where many people have worked before with different approaches, with different tools, and we try to do something really different with the data that we could get our hands on, because there are always limitations on when accessing public data, public sector data in this case. But we have two interesting cases to show you, and feel free to ask questions when we are presenting. So please interrupt whenever.
Yes, exactly. And that's indeed what you can do. So while you're watching this, you can ask questions to Nuno. You can share your own experiences in the chat. So we keep an eye on that, and we will pick it up along the way. So let's get started right away. So public policy evaluation, right? Public policies are, of course, we have this political dimension. People have new laws, new initiatives because they want to influence the society in a good way. And so one of the questions is, how effective are these strategies? So, of course, evaluating what is being done. Yeah, that's like the overall art, right, of this application area that we're looking at here today. But maybe to take a little step back, tell us first a little bit more about your association. It's called Food4Sustainability CoLAB. What is Food4Sustainability?
In a nutshell, Food4Sustainability is a collaborative laboratory. It's an entity of the scientific and technological system. So we do research and we get funds also to do some research, but we are closest to the market. So we interface entities. And in Portugal, we have competency centers and we have CoLABs, collaborative laboratories. They both are created as privately owned organizations. In our case, we are a non-for-profit private association of 12 members. And we get 1/3 of our activity funded to do research. And then the second third of our activity should come from co-funded projects, so competitive funding. And the last third should come from services or other kinds of own sources. Yeah. This is basically the front office financial sustainability model that we adapted for Portugal and for these two kinds of entities.
Yeah, I was about to say that. So at Fraunhofer, they're not purely researching, but they're also doing projects and more interacting more closely with the market. So that's a little bit similar to what you're describing.
Yeah, in our case, there is a big difference. There are currently 41 CoLABs in Portugal. we can say that maybe too many, but I'm not going to discuss that. But there's a big difference in our CoLAB because we started collaborating. Startup accelerator called BGI, Building Global Innovators, that spun out of the MIT Portugal program. So BGI was created to hold the shareholdings in startups that were supported by the acceleration programs. And BGI scouted international startups to take to the USA, and started with an immersion program in Boston that we keep doing for the last 10 years, and also an international accelerator based in Lisbon. So this organization was at the time publicly owned by a university and a public sector VC, partnered with the municipality of Idanha Nova, which is one of the largest municipalities in Portugal in terms of area, but one with the lowest population density. I was just mentioning that due to the abandonment of some agriculture productions like tomato and tobacco in the region from the 50s, Idanha lost 70% of the population.
So, yeah, can you maybe describe a little bit where that region is in Portugal, so some people might have in mind the shape of the country? So where are you talking about?
If you look at Iberia, Portugal and Spain, Portugal is the rectangle, the small rectangle on the left side, and Idanha is in the center of Portugal, closest to Spain. And it's one of the biggest municipalities. We have over 300 municipalities, and Idanha is at the same distance of Lisbon, Porto, and Madrid. So it's quite
so far away from everything.
Well, but you can say that it's central because you can access Madrid the same way you go to Lisbon. So
that's true.
It's about the same distance. So Idanha Nova was struggling, and they designed a new policy to take people back to the territory and to develop some new businesses. And they, of course, are a rural municipality, so they invested a lot in organic farming. So they were part of the first bioregion in Portugal. They are also within the area of one geopark of UNESCO. They also are a city of music, so they have a lot of international distinctions. They did that because they wanted to attract more people and more companies to the territory.
Yeah.
And the purpose of connecting with VGI was to develop research related to agriculture.
Right, and that's also the project, right, in which you applied cross-mining, is about looking at policies, how they affect farmers. So you are looking at agricultural policies and funding programs, right? Can you tell a little bit about the project in which you applied process mining?
This was a co-funded project led by one Polytechnical Institute, which is one of our founding members, the Polytechnical of Viseu, which is a bit further to the north relative to Idanha. And the end customer was actually the national authority that manages and controls all public funding in Portugal. It's the Agency for Development and Cohesion, and they coordinate all the funding programs that are then assigned to different public agencies for management. So they hold the helicopter view of everything that is being funded, and they were the end customer because they wanted to ask the universities, and in this case, the Polytechnical of Viseu, another company in IT, and our CoLAB, we partnered to give them a different view of the data they already hold. So this was the purpose, and of course, it was not expected to be whatever came out of the project was not expected to be immediately applied, but should bring new perspectives of how public policy can be evaluated and monitored in time. And especially in our case, we focused on agriculture because it's very difficult to establish cause-effect relationships. So if we invest in buying one tractor, we will get more production. And sometimes it's not like that because it's quite complex. We are dealing with nature, and it's not like a factory where all the processes can be streamlined. In farming, different things happen.
Right, exactly, yes. And you looked at public data, right? You mentioned that already. You did not only use process mining, you also looked at it with some statistical tools. But what are the main questions that one wants to answer when you're looking at effectiveness of a public policy?
It's very common for these agencies to look only at the KPIs they have to deliver. So the country commits to delivering a certain number of goals, and they sometimes just focus on understanding how close they are to meeting the target. And this is not looking at the impact, it's looking at something that someone along the process decided that should be measured, and then became a goal, and they have to deliver it. But they understand very little about the dynamics that these new public policies and new funding opportunities bring to the economy. So how companies react, and that was actually the purpose of our project, was to explore more the dynamics and how companies behaved in face of changes in policy and funding opportunities.
Yep.
And as you mentioned, there were three of us, and the Polytechnical of Viseu worked on the raw data to put together different tables that were available in different funding agencies to give us a complete view as much as possible of what were the projects that were funded. Then we had to filter that to look at agriculture. And because we are talking about agriculture, there are basically two kinds of aid. One, which is a direct aid for farmers. If I'm producing almonds in organic mode, then I can apply to get funding because I'm doing it in organic. But then we also have investment projects and innovation projects. In this case, I apply to get the funding to do the investments. And hopefully at the end of the investment, I will be in a better place. I will have better, processes, products, services, whatever the scope of the project is. But these two were analyzed differently. So we looked at direct aid, which has one thing which is very good for the analysis that we wanted to deliver, which was is a reflection of what farmers are actually doing. not what they intend to do to make their productions better. So the second part, of course, gives us the look into the future. And then we can analyze different things. What is the intention behind the investment? What is the expectation that they have? Of course, this can be richer or poorer depending on the data that we get. And we got very little data because they were very concerned about giving us data beyond the limits of law. And of course, we had to write some legal recommendations to assure them that what we were doing was legal and we were not putting them at risk. But in spite of all of that, we got very little data, but still we were able to find some interesting insights within the very few data points that we get.
Let's look at that to make it a little bit more concrete. So you have talked about the goals, but how does this look like in practice, right? And you just mentioned the very little data, but also I think it's not just that there's maybe not much data, but also the type of data that you have, right? The data that's collected or that's available based on, for example, these direct aid to pharma applications. So it's a form of, how you say, subsidies, right, that you can apply for. It's not at all process mining data or process data. So it's
not at all
static data. So so we, in fact, to make it more concrete, we brought two cases here today, and you will show us for these two different types of data sets, how you analyze them to show a little bit the types of questions that you could then answer once you shaped the data to the level that you needed it. So so let's maybe look first at the raw data for the first case. So I bring that up here on my screen. Let me know when you can see that. Yeah. So that's the original data, right? That's when you mentioned different tables were brought together. And these are two of the tables is that the direct aid to farmers, or which type of?
Exactly, it's the direct aid to farmers, and we got 3 files for each calendar year. So this is an annual process. Every year farmers apply by June, July. We just extended this year the deadline because there are new rules. So making all this exercise more interesting, because we analyzed the data between 2015 and 2020. And
so we have 5 years of data, right? 5 years of data.
6 years.
6 years. Oh yeah, you're right. 15, including 15 and 20. Yes.
So we got one file. The top one states that company was in one municipality and they moved to another municipality. So this was already, This tells us that the company is headquartered in one municipality. And based on this data, we can immediately understand the ones that moved from one municipality to the other, because in different years they reported a different headquarter. Yes. And usually they, when they change the headquarters, because they change production to a different place. So this is what we can get out of the first file.
Right, but maybe before we move on, let's think about it in terms of the process mining data that we're looking at, right? So if we have this data and now we want to see, okay, where is the process view that we can take on that? So actually the ID is maybe the easiest thing in this type of data that we already have, right? We have the case, we can use it as a case ID, because the ID, what it is, it's either the text ID if it's
it's the text ID if it's a company, if it's a person, it's a pseudonymized ID, so that we cannot identify immediately the person, but we have the same ID in different years, so we can correlate the data and see what changed from year to year. So
exactly. So the same company over year, if it appears again, we see that they apply again. And so we follow the same company over the 6 years or the same person over the 6 years,
and
right?
that
That's
was
the case.
The purpose. Yeah. The purpose was to use process mining as a tool to, one, understand the dynamics, and to look at the dynamics, we need to focus on the organization, the agent. So the company, the farmer, is our process. Yeah. And we see what the agent does over time. So we are looking for changes that are significant and that we can analyze and we can use for segmenting. So it's very different from aggregating data and looking at who was the farmer that got the most money out of state aid. But if we look at the dynamics, if we look at events over time, we can define a profile, and we can look at different entities going through the same process, so the same changes over time, and we can understand better how they dealt with the new opportunities and how they looked at changes in public policy. So that's profiling using events over time and not some static or aggregated element of companies.
Exactly, yes. But if just to emphasize that again, right? If we look at the static data to actually get that out, we have to make some interpretations of the data or some assumptions and some choices, essentially, right? Because if we're looking at it, that's really all the data that we have. The ID is there. We can use that as a case ID. But for example, we don't even have timestamps, right? There's no time. Essentially, the time is implicit because you have these same tables for these 6 years. You have it for 2015, you have it for 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. Right? Yeah. So that's the timestamp. And then in terms of the activity, it's just like just to emphasize that again, what you just explained, you're looking at certain significant changes. So you're looking at the static data, and from year to year, if you see a significant change from one year to the other for the same entity, you are creating an event about this change, right? One that you mentioned with the table above is if the headquarters move.
Exactly. Yeah. So change in the headquarters. If I cannot find the company in 2015, but then it appears in 2016, we see that as a company starting a new activity. And if they stop applying for the state aid, it's because they closed that activity. So the beginning and the end of the activity does not appear in the process for everyone, but just the ones that started or finished within that time frame. So the ones that kept operating from 2015 to 2020, there are no changes, no relevant changes to note. So we don't have events for that.
Yes. And also, but what you did look at were the changes that were significant, right? So for example, if we imagine one company or one person applies for this direct aid with this amount of, because you have information about the area, so this is the agriculture area, the number of animals, and then there's also information about the amount of aid they got, right? So when you say you're looking at significant changes, you're looking for a difference, for example, in area, in animals, or in aid, right? So was it 20% up or down? Was the significant?
It was 20% up and down that we used as a threshold, not to generate millions of new events, but just to focus on the most relevant changes. Yeah. So if someone reported in 1 year 100 hectares, and then in the next year they went up to 500, that's very significant change. So they are investing a lot. So we counted that as a relevant event. If they go from 100 to 110, it's not that significant. Maybe they already had that area, but they were not producing, and then they expanded slightly their production to more 10 hectares.
Yes.
But we used 20% as a threshold. We could have set a different threshold, but that was the one that we used.
Exactly. So maybe we can, so that's the static data that we just looked at. Let's take a look at what you made from that, right? So to make process mining data, if you see the Excel sheet here now, that's basically what you created from those two static tables. And what we can see here is, first of all, also the ID. So that's the case ID that comes back. And then essentially, so that's also a choice that you made, right? You used the year based on in which year a certain change was noted compared to the previous year. So for example, 2019 here, initial activity, that means that this company or person applied for the first time in 2019 and there wasn't any entry for them in 2018, 17, 16 or 15. So that's why that kind of new start activity is here, right? We see where it is also. And what's the last column also? That's some additional data field here that you created.
So in the third, we use that not to characterize the entity, because we were looking at different aspects and the dynamics of the entity and the decisions they made, but to look at different municipalities and to understand the companies that are established in each municipality. Are the ones getting more money, less money, or they are just in the middle? So we classified each entity according to the total amount of aid they got over the whole period. And in that case that you showed, well, the second case is even stronger. In the last year, one organization initiated an activity or they applied for the first time and they were already considered in the top third of the ones that got more money. Yeah. So this is a huge production for sure, and they started late, and I can explain why this happens. It has to do with this kind of analysis. So in this case, we are not looking at the choices and the outcomes of the choices that each entity took, but the characterization of municipalities. What kind of companies are established there and are operating there?
Yeah, and we will see that a little bit more back in a moment, right? Once we start looking at the data with process mining. Maybe just to show a little bit more. So here in the beginning, it's just how the data is structured. So first you created the activities, because you really had to create the activities and the timestamps out of nothing in a way, right? They were implicitly hidden in the data.
Absolutely.
So here it's kind of the initial one, but if we scroll down a little bit at some point in time, here, for example, that means that help or the aid was increased.
Increased the amount of aid.
Increased the amount of aid. And that's how much it was increased, or?
Exactly. That's the percentage of increase.
Yeah. And then if we scroll down, so there are these different activities that you created. For example, here the area was increased. So that's someone who applied the next year compared to the previous year with more area. So 20% more at least, right? So to categorize, to be significant for that. And so here we also have reduction. So this would be a reduction of aid, more than 20% less than the year before. So this is kind of the way the data is structured.
This was almost all the magic of the project was finding data where we did not have explicit data.
Yes. Yeah, and now we can see what you could do with it, right? So I think we understand now what you did. So again, if we're importing this Excel sheet now that you created from the static data in Disco, we see the ID column. So that's still the VAT number or the the ID, commercial ID, or the anonymized personal ID, and then the timestamp, and then the activity name, and the 3 attributes, right? The region, how much the difference was if there's a change in, for example, area or age or things like that, and then whether they got a high amount, a medium amount, or a low amount of support overall. So if we import that, we can maybe look at a case to see how the data is there. And what you mentioned before also is that if there's kind of no change in between, right? So imagine there's a company that applies 2017 for a certain amount of aid, and then 2017, 2018, it applies for the same amount of aid, and 2019 again for the same amount of aid, then you wouldn't actually detect any change. So you would not generate kind of one of these change activities that you created, right? There would be nothing because there was no change.
Just the beginning of the activity and ending, if they stop by some reason to apply to state aid. But otherwise, if they were already applying before 2015 and there are no changes and they kept applying until the end of the period, there are no relevant changes.
Yeah.
So we will not report those entities.
Yeah, so we can see that here, for example, right? So if we look at this one case here, it's just one of the cases where they started in 2016. So that means that in 2015, they were not present,
applying for this kind of aid.
Right. And then in 2017, they increased the area and they got more aid. And then in 2020...
So they increased the area for over 40%.
Oh, yeah.
And in the same year, they got more 22% in aid. Mm-hmm. And there were no significant changes between 17 and 20. And in 2020, they got more 36% in aid.
So what could be a reason for them getting more aid, although they didn't change or increase the area?
They changed their practices. They aligned their production better with the requirements, and they got more money because of that. Not because they increased the area, and they did the same production system in the new area, but because they improved the way they produced in the area they already had. Yeah. So maybe converting to organic or implementing what is now called eco schemes under the new CAP and Common Agriculture Policy has this kind of effect.
Yeah.
Back in that period, it was called greening, and farmers were given a greater amount if they implemented some practices.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know, and also shows that you really have to know the background, like what are the processes behind this to interpret this, but also all the choices that you made to create the data are really important to understand the meaning of things. So for example, maybe one thing I wanted to clarify for the people who are looking at the maps, more with the eyes of a process miner. Usually when we're looking at process maps, we often see kind of start and end activities, and here they're not standard, or not in the same way standard start and end activities as we know them usually. So for example, here this particular case has this start activity in the very first event, like we said, because there was no activity in 2015, right? But so if we're looking at the map, for example, here, if we're looking at the case coverage, we can see it's actually just 20% of all the cases that have that. That means that 80% of the cases they had already, they already applied and got subsidy in the very first year, 2015.
Exactly. So this means that in the period we got 20% new farmers, and we lost some farmers because they stopped applying for the aid. So this is the kind of dynamics that we are looking to understand.
Right. And here, for example, we can look at the ones who came new into the support program. But it's just 20%, and it's not useful just to look at those 20%, which you often would do as a data cleaning step, like in the traditional cross-mining way. But here it has a different meaning, so it's more to be seen as this is a new participant in the system. And for most of the analysis, you would want to actually look at the full picture and not just the ones that started in the period. But we can see some of the statistics already here, right? For example, what the biggest increase in area, increase in aid. These are kind of the biggest kind of changes that we see. But you also looked at the other statistics, like the municipalities, for example, that you mentioned.
Exactly. Well, just a short comment about the process diagram and the animation. It was obviously quite new for the public authority to look at this hidden data in a process map where they can see immediately what sequences were more relevant in the whole data that they had. So it was we had to explain them how to look for evidence and hints in the diagrams. And we also showed the animation so that they could see over time where there was a big concentration of activities of one type, and they can also interpret what was the cause for that. Because in some cases we just see the increase in the amount of aid, and that can be because they just gave more money to farmers without any changes in their production system. The amount was per hectare or per animal was increased, and that has an immediate effect if it's significant enough. And we can see some of the bubbles flowing when they did that, in the year they did that increase. So this dynamic aspect was quite new to them. They were not used to seeing data over time.
Yeah, like you mentioned before, they were looking at the KPIs, right? They were used to measure, but this kind of process view, like over time developments, that's kind of a new way of thinking. And now we're looking at everything together, but I think what you then also can do with this type of data is look at it with the understanding of the municipalities behind and of the behavior that you can expect, right, from these types of systems and programs. So we wanted to show you some of the analysis that you then did based on that. And I think one of the things is looking at the municipalities. A lot of them are from the north, or?
Exactly. So Portugal is a very small country, but with big asymmetries. And we have large farms in the south, and we have very small farms in the north. So we also see that those small farms in the north change more often than the big farms in the south. So there were more changes because we have more companies in the north and smaller farms, and because they are more dynamic, they make adjustments very fast. So if there is a new incentive, they react immediately, and they apply all the measures they need to access the new incentive. Whereas in the south, large farms are harder to change, so we don't see that kind of dynamics. And we compared some of the municipalities that we know quite well.
Let's do that. Let's pick the first one. So we saved them here to do it a little bit quicker. So the first one you looked at is Idana.
So actually Idana Nova is the place where we are headquartered. It's a large municipality. It was once very important in terms of farming and agriculture. Now we see again an increase in in the use of land. One, because the municipality is investing and renting land that is owned by the state of Portugal, and they are assigning that land to farmers for a very low price initially. Now prices have gone up and they are quite expensive at the moment. But in the beginning, the municipality started this process of giving back land from the state to farmers. So we can see that in the data. So there is a prevalence of companies getting more money overall.
Yeah, because Portugal. Alto, that means it's the upper third, the
upper
higher
third. So the lowest percentage is of farmers in the lower third, which means that they got less money over the whole period 2015 to 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other one that you looked at is another one that you know quite well, right? So let's
it's another municipality. It's called Ruda dos Vinhos. It's close to Lisbon. Actually, it's 30 kilometers outside Lisbon. It's very close to the largest food market in Portugal, which is the food market that serves the whole region of Lisbon. But they have very few professional farmers, as to say. So everyone has a backyard. They all produce something, but in very small scales. So there is only one farm above 50 hectares, and there are maybe 10 or 15 above 10 hectares. So
it's the 50%. They're all in the lower third.
So they have very little access to water. While in Idanha we have 3,000 to 5,000 hectares served by an irrigation system. So we can do irrigated farming. In Ruda, it's very difficult to get access to water. Yes. So it's also something, and they are just starting with the same program to assign the bank of land to new farmers. So it's just starting. Let's see where it goes, but it's of course smaller in scale. But if we see a lot of new farmers appearing in Ruda, we know because it's the policy is working and they are able to attract new investors.
Yeah, that's really good. So there's another region also that you know very well, right? That you also looked at.
It's important to mention that in Ruda we have more farmers in the lower third, so the ones that get less money, because farmers are small, they don't produce a lot, they don't care about agroecological practices that would give them more money. So in the past it was like this. We are now looking forward to seeing what will happen in the future, because in Ruda there are new policies being implemented, and we are also involved in that. So we are looking forward to seeing some changes in Ruda.
Yeah. Okay, so you would expect to see kind of the portion of medium and high support to increase relatively to...
Exactly. So let's see what happens in the future, because of course in the future, now in the present, we are already implementing the new Common Agriculture Policy, and every country has a specific strategic plan to implement the European rules. But what we see is that now it's more demanding for farmers to get access to this kind of funding. They have to implement more agroecological practices than before. So overall, in the future, we will see a decrease in the amount of aid, regardless of changes in area and the number of animals.
Because so the bar is raised for them to get support.
Bar is raised.
Okay, so you will see monitor these changes and see them, how it works out in the future. What can you tell us about the other region? You mentioned another region that you also know very well. So this is the Beja district, actually different municipalities. So
exactly,
we prepared it here, so we can see it's several, right? It's like 10 or 12, at least 15.
Yeah, and we could add a few from other districts also. In the south of Portugal, we have a huge investment in irrigation. It's called the Alqueva, and the Alqueva now provides water to around 120,000 hectares, and there are lots of new investments, especially in olives. It's 2/3, about 80,000 hectares of intensive olive groves. And then we have around, now already above 20,000 hectares in intensive and super intensive almond productions. Well, we should say that after the USA, which is by far the largest world producer of almonds, Spain is the second, and Portugal is catching up with Spain. Of course, we have a smaller size overall, so we cannot ambition to become a huge international player, but we are already implementing a lot of new almond groves in Portugal, and especially in the south, in Alqueva.
Yeah, almonds really use a lot of water, right?
And we have other crops, but the majority is olives and almonds. And especially these municipalities are being hugely impacted. So the oldest almond grove I know in the region has maybe 9 years, and it started producing with stable levels maybe just 4 or 5 years ago. So we can see that effect of Alqueva in the numbers.
How can you see that in the map? Like, how do you interpret the process map with that background in mind?
The ones that started the activity and that are in the high third are very likely investments in Alqueva. So when we look at the amount of money they get, because of course the area is quite large, they have thousands of hectares. It really shows in the process that they started the activity, they are already in the top third, and they increase the amount of aid and the area very fast over time and very significantly.
Yeah, we can see that very, very clearly here, this link from increasing area and increasing aid. Yeah.
So, I think this is a way for micro-segmenting all the operators in the country that apply to state aid. We cannot look at them as being the same, because they all make different decisions, and they are in different regions where policies can promote or not the installation of new operators. So this is the kind of segmenting that we need to do to really interpret the reaction of companies to public policy.
Yeah. So that's one direction, right? So that you look at a specific region or municipality where you know the structure and see how they develop. But what I also found very interesting is the last example that we prepared for this first case is where you're looking from the process perspective, from the development perspective. For example, we know that we can see increase in area, but also there's reduction of area or reduction in animals. And one of the kind of the patterns you were interested in, which are the farmers that decrease area or decrease animals and increase the aid, right? So let me bring that up, and you can tell us a little bit what's behind this specific type of analysis. Let's maybe first look at the post-mining view of that. So then, of course, when we apply the filter, so that's kind of what you can do with the follower filter, right? We're looking at process patterns.
Exactly.
So we're looking at, in this case, directly followed. So we want to see, because that's in the same year, that a reduction of animals or area, or in the next year, is followed by more aid. So if we apply that, let's say reduction area or animals, more aid. So it's not that many, right? It's a really small portion. We see it's just 3%.
Really a small group, but very important one, because what happened in these companies was that they really understood the requirements for getting more incentives and more money from the practices. They invested in implementing those practices. Mm-hmm. So we can see this group as the pioneers of what is happening now. So now public policy is more demanding, and we are requiring farmers to make changes to keep getting some money, but not anything close to what they got in the past. These are the pioneers. These were the ones that saw first that there was a trend that would get them to where we are now, more demanding policies, and they started operating changes in their productions to optimize their economic return. So they have less area, but they are getting more margin out of it, because with the changes in the production system, they also increase the resilience, they reduce risks, they reduce the inputs, and now farming inputs are quite expensive and some are becoming unavailable. So even if you want to buy fertilizers or pesticides, it's hard to get them in the market, and the prices are really high. Mm. That's why they made the adjustments very early, and they saw the return.
Yeah, so we can
they reduced the area and animals, and they got more money out of the aid.
For example, if we just pick a case here and try to imagine what happened here. For example, this one or that one. Let's pick the third one here. So they started in 2016, they reduced the area in 2019 and increased the aid in 2019, right?
Exactly.
By
so
50%. So that's quite significant, isn't it?
They reduced 30% the area, and they increased over 50% the amount of aid. And then they moved to a different municipality, to Alcotim, and they got 20% more with the same. We cannot compare because it was the last year. Maybe we could compare to 2021, but in this case, we see that they got 20% more money out of the relocation. So maybe these are annual crops, and they used already certified organic fields to produce, and they got more money with the same.
Yeah. So by
area.
Exactly. So by identifying kind of desirable patterns like that, that's also a possibility then to go and visit those farmers and to see maybe what they are doing right? To discover some best practices perhaps, or share that with the community.
And also, we are not looking at the ones that keep doing the same thing year over year. We are looking to find the ones that anticipate and that pioneer and invest in new practices, and also the ones that don't get the message and get less money even after investing more. So if we do the search of the ones that increase the area, increase the animals, and reduce the amount of aid, maybe we can find a few that misread the whole intention of the public policy. So by micro-segmenting and looking at these specific cases, we get more information to adjust public policy. And maybe it's not a matter of increasing the amount of aid per hectare. It's a matter of providing more support and information to farmers so that they can have access to the amount that is already assigned and available.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yes. So I think this brings us to the end of the first case, and we wanted to also briefly look at a second case where it's a different type of aid program, right? Before we looked at direct aid for farmers. So what kind of project funding is this case about?
The second case, we took all the projects from Portugal 2020, so it was really a huge list, and we tried to filter to get the ones more related to agriculture, but in some cases it was not possible to clearly make the distinction because some calls were specific for farming and others were not. And we also looked at it with a different perspectives. So what you are seeing now is quite complex. It's called Praxiological Assessment Technology. It's something that one of my colleagues worked a lot in previous years and did a PhD thesis based on this. Of course, there's a lot of work done before. So this is a way to look at action and intention. So the intentionality behind action and what can happen of positive and negative coming from action and intention. So we see that the positive side is the top half. We can see the benefits, savings, fortune, wisdom, hope, and aims. And I wouldn't like to define all these terms because this comes from an intersection of technology and philosophy. I don't have the expertise to fully explain, but for you to understand that there are some things that are positive, and we can see the intersection between what was the action and what was the intention and the outcomes. So on the left side, we can see the objectives. On the right side, we can see the results. And in some cases, the objectives led to results, but there's also the case of objectives not leading to results or some results appearing that were not part of our objectives. Yeah. So that's where we see action and intention we compare objectives and results and intersect the two sets.
Right.
And of course, this can be positive or negative, and we give a meaning to each part of the intersections. This is all based on three basic fundamental variables. One is the ability to plan. So if we got a result that we could not plan for, like winning the lottery, that's a very positive thing, but we cannot plan it. We cannot draw a plan to win the lottery. The second attribute is if it is achievable. So maybe something we can plan for is not achievable currently. And the third one is desirability. Is it desirable? Is it something that we want or something that we want to avoid? And I'm done with explaining the Praxiological Assessment Technology. What's important for you is that out of more than 400 different calculations that we can make based on this model, we chose 10, and the aim was to again segment the companies, the operators that invested in some cases. They invested in more than one project over the period that we analyzed. So we wanted to compare the performance over time in each one of these 10 dimensions, or out of more than 400 that we can calculate and give meaning to.
I think we can make it more concrete if we look at the data, right? So let's maybe let's do that. So like you said, you selected 10, but before we get there, let's look at the data again. So I have the import screen here. The NIF, that's the ID. So that's basically the same setup that we had with the first case. So it's either a company or it's a person, anonymized.
It's a person. Yeah.
Right. And it's again data over multiple years. But the difference here is that it's not this kind of direct aid that's being awarded to the person or the entity, but it's project-based. So essentially it could be that in a single year, one company or one person could apply for multiple projects. Let's say they have 10 projects, and each of these 10 projects will be in the data. I'm not sure if this is kind of a project ID. Is that kind of, for example?
On the left side, the first column is the project ID.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, and we will see that how it comes to that, because if we go towards the end here, so there's a lot of additional fields in between, but towards the end is how you then included these dimensions, right? So we have, that's basically the PAT dimensions that you mentioned,
exactly.
Which are a mix
so
of...
So the PAT, we are talking about technical efficiency, productivity, intentionality. So we can calculate a lot of dimensions, and we applied these calculations to performance over two variables, time and cost. So we got initially very few data points, like what was the expected cost or the overall investment that was planned for the project, and we compare that with the actual cost of the project. So this means that typically in this kind of co-funded projects, we cannot go above what was planned, but in some cases we can. Some exceptions, we can go above what was proposed initially, but we are measured for achieving the same that we applied for. So when we compare proposed to actual, would be the best scenario, because we invested what was planned. Then we compared also the planned start and end date with the actual start and end date of the project. So these are the two dimensions, cost and time.
Exactly. So, for example, if I think productivity is one of those, right, where you're looking at time and cost. And so, for example, if time is total, that means that the whole time of the project that was used. But
so
if
it was optimal. So when we see, we then classified each project according to the quartile. And we have two additional classifications for zero. So null means that we did not invest anything, and total when it's infinity. So when it was optimal.
Fully, yes. Maybe to look at it in a different way. So if you apply for a project and you get the project approved, that doesn't mean that you get the project the money automatically, but you basically have the right to make investments, for example, and then you have to show you have made this investment. Let's say you have bought this machine, you have created this area, things like that, and then you would get money from the project. But so that means if people if they don't make these steps, then they also don't receive the money from the project. So if they don't,
it's a huge problem for the ones managing the funding program, because as in airways, they also do overbooking. They approve more than the money they have to assign to the projects. But they already know that some of the promoters won't be able to make the full investment, and the goal for them is to get to the end of the program, and with all the projects executed, they made the best possible use of the money they had available. So this means that when some will not execute the project or underperform, and some of the best performers can go a bit above what was initially planned, but overall they want to assign and make the best use of the whole budget that is available. They don't want to leave money on the table.
Yes, exactly. So that's their perspective. But when we now look again at the process view that you can create from this data, it's essentially what you're looking at, how the productivity of certain performers changes over the time and over different projects, right? So maybe let's look at an example to make this more concrete. So we have already imported the data here. So if we look at just one case, initially it's not that useful yet because we have all the data together, right? You mentioned you have these 10.
We have to filter and look at one attribute at a time.
Yes. So here, for example, we see for the first project, it's just, we can see this is all one project up to row 20.
And because there are 20 data points per project.
Have these 10 dimensions, and then it's always per time and per cost. So we have 20 for each project. So this means if we're looking here, this is over 5 years for this particular company or person. They actually had 280 rows, so 14 projects in total. But we're looking at everything at once, so that's not really useful. So what you can do now is, though, like you just mentioned, choose one of those dimensions, right? So that's what we did also with, and we again saved it here. The productivity time perspective is one, or time productivity that you can choose, which is exactly a combination of, in this case, one of those 10 dimensions, which is productivity and time, right? And so this means exactly what we just talked about. So if you, for example, if you have applied for the project for 4 years, but only after 2 years you start receiving money because only then you took actions to get the money, then it's like you only used 50%, right? Is this the correct interpretation?
No, we did not get into that level of detail because we didn't have the data, but we can see how the same company performed over time in different projects.
Yes, but can you explain then what does it mean? For example, the first project, we see there are 14 projects for this one company over time from 2015 till 2016. There were a lot in 2016.
So we are looking at the percentile, and we see that taking in consideration the whole universe of all funded projects, the first project that started in December 2015 and that lasted for 5 years was between percentile 25 and 50. So it was average low performance. But the second one that started in January 2016, one of those, because they started a lot, in this case, a lot of new projects, some of them, they had optimal performance. So they had few projects that were managed and executed perfectly, and some we are looking at time and productivity, and I'm not explaining what productivity in time is, but we can see that there is a difference in performance over time.
Right.
So in this case, we are looking at an entity that started a lot of projects in the same day or almost at the same time. Just one started in April and was not January. But in this other case, we can see that the projects were more spread over time, and they had optimal performance
for most of them,
almost. Just two were not that well.
Right. So in that sense, just to emphasize that once more again, so the process view that we're taking here on the data, again, it's not really there, but it's kind of a process view that you're taking on that because you're interested in these temporal developments, right, in this process, is that the same person or company has projects, sometimes in the same year, sometimes over multiple years, but how does it develop over time? And you can evaluate this in these different dimensions. So for example, we can do this here for this chosen dimension, time and productivity. It's actually useful for that dimension, right, to look at projects that have more than, to look at performers who have more than one project. So we can add that here through a performance filter. Let's do that. Based on number of events, because if there's just one project, you can't really see, how they develop over time. So let's use 2 projects at the minimum. Something went wrong here. 2. And then once we apply that time productivity, multiple projects, then you can start looking at how the performance develops, right?
Yeah. So we can see that most performed well, optimally, but there were some changes in performance over time, and we can see what happened with. Again, we are micro-segmenting. We are looking at the set of companies that had the same path over time. So in this case, we looked at the ones that had better performance, and later they had projects with lower performance. So it's understandable that in the first co-funded project, you are learning, you don't know how to manage it and how to do the reporting and how you will be assessed. And you make some mistakes and you learn, and then the next one goes well because you already learned. So from low to high performance, it's expected that you learn over time. But what happens when you are already performing well and then some projects go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. So that's
So this is the kind of subgroups that we wanted to find and to better understand what happened over time, which programs were in which co-funding programs were the projects that went wrong, and see in which regions, and try to understand also that connection to the intention behind those programs and the ability to execute of the companies that applied and got those fundings.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and you can look at it from different directions, right? You mentioned the ones that were good but were declining, but you can also look at the ones that didn't start at all. So, for example, if we see the ones here with the lowest category, so that means they didn't activate any of the project funding, right? So we want to focus on those. For example, we could filter for them here and then say no projects. But then you can also look further and see they move from 0 to above 0.
We
right?
filtered and we are looking at the entities. So it's 7% of companies that had at least one project that was not executed.
Yeah.
And we can see that, of course, we have the 916 that were not executed, but we can see that the same companies also had projects that were delivered, some with delay, but we had 503 entities that performed optimally in at least one project. So it now gives us some indication to see which funding programs, when the projects happened, in which region were they executed, to find possible causes for this low performance. So we are talking about entities that already had performed well and something went dramatically wrong in a few projects.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for sharing these examples. I think that really shows like the type of thinking and the types of questions that are then also relevant questions, right? In this space of evaluating the policies and how is it working, how are these programs being used, how do they develop over time? And as we have seen, you can approach it from the perspective of the individual municipalities or areas, regions with some knowledge behind it, but you can also look at the overall pattern and then see, okay, where do we see these types of desirable or undesirable patterns being manifested, and is it tied to specific programs, is it tied to specific areas, or even visiting concrete farmers, for example, to see what they are doing, to exhibit certain behaviors. So thanks very much for sharing this with us. So you mentioned it already a little bit before, but it's, I imagine not just for us a new way of applying process mining, but like you said, also for the people making these policies, kind of a new way at looking at their data. Is it something that you had the impression they understood, or was it difficult for them, to get into this kind of process thinking perspective? What was your experience?
We did public presentations of the findings of the whole project. So this was just one part. We also did the hardcore Praxiological Assessment Technology part, and we also developed a few dashboards to explore correlations between some attributes that we cannot immediately correlate, but somehow the data say that they are highly correlated. So we did the dashboards to find those correlations. We did the Praxiological Assessment Technology because it was something completely different and new, and a lot to explain. It was very hard to explain the whole complexity of path. And then we used process mining. And from process mining, they now know that they can look at data in a different way. So they can look at the dynamics and they can micro-segment the companies they are serving to understand what are the motivations, what are the actions that they do, what are the outcomes and the results that come from those decisions and those actions. So it's a completely new field for them. They acknowledged that it was completely new for them. They were interested, but as I said before, they have been focused on controlling the KPI for so long that it's very hard for them to adopt a new way of looking at data. Yeah. Because they still need to deliver the KPI. But of course, now that we have so many new co-funding programs, it's very important for them to start looking at these new approaches. And of course, we will do a follow-up analysis of these same aspects that we showed here today with new data from this new policy framework to provide them with some evidence that this is very important, and this gives them information to act before the program reaches an end, because they are used to reporting when the program ends and not making decisions to change and to adapt the policy throughout the program.
That's a good point, yeah, to change while the program is running, to steer it in the right direction, right? To Absolutely. Make it more effective.
That was our purpose. They were very interested, but it will take time until they adopt these kind of tools to improve the way they use the money.
Yeah, and for you as the analyst, like you mentioned, you used also different tools like classical statistical analysis. What specifically for you did the process mining tool add to your analysis capabilities? What type of thing could you do better or at all that you can't do with kind of just working with Excel?
We just showed a few ways of using the sequence of events to finding subgroups of entities that perform the same way, that have the same execution over time. So this is impossible to do without process mining, or at least a lot more difficult. And we tried also to stretch a bit the limits of what we were doing to really show that you cannot get answers to these questions in a different way. But of course, we had to start by finding data that was not explicit and building the process with a lot of things that initially were not a process, and use then the process mining tool to answer specific questions that cannot be answered in a different way.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So if you have maybe more data available, maybe you can do an even richer analysis and also have richer development patterns for these types of behavioral kind of processes, adoption processes.
Absolutely. With more data, we can, we did this with very few data points.
Yeah.
And we were able to deliver some insightful information for the policymakers. And we also have now the obligation to do the same analysis once we get new data from the current framework program, to show them how companies are reacting to the new policies and this will be very important for them.
Yeah, because there's some changes in the policies, right? Also the direct aid approach is being reduced, you mentioned, and so there are some changes to be expected. So it will be interesting to see how
Absolutely.
that works out. All right. Any last words you want to say maybe for other people who want to apply postman in the same area, or anything else before we close?
Well, the main point for me today is to show you that with some creativity we can make a lot of data explicit from the few data that we have access to. So if you are creative, you are able to find the hidden data. Then you can be surprised with what you can do with the new data.
Absolutely, we absolutely have seen that. So thanks a lot for sharing this really interesting example. Thanks a lot for coming on the show, for being here with us, telling us all about the project. Thanks to you watching out there. We are going to be on a short summer break for August, and we will be back with a new Postman in Café in September. Until then, thanks a lot, Nuno. Thanks, everyone. See you again very soon.